Hello everyone, here to do a lecture on chapter 34, excuse me, which is pretty much FDR foreign policy. I will not be here tomorrow, so this is primarily for fourth hour who's going to miss out on this. Okay, so hopefully you've read chapter 34, but if you haven't, this lecture should do a pretty good job of kind of getting you up to speed. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. When we went through chapter 31, the 1920s, we, for the most part, skipped pretty much any kind of foreign policy. So I want to real quickly touch on this. It's pretty interesting when you look at the foreign policy of the 1920s and 1930s. You can very much see a very big shift, kind of moving away from America wanting to be this world power, this this stage that we're in the early 20th century, this imperialistic stage. And then we have this massive shift to isolationism. Okay, and it's very profound. And we can see throughout the 20s and out the 30s, you can just tell that America is basically pulling away from the world, that we don't want to be a part of what's going on, and to a certain extent, obviously in the 1930s, we have our own problems to deal with the Great Depression, but we are not interested in any way in, like I said, being part of that world community. And so here you can see a bunch of acts or conferences or events or whatever that take place in the 20s and 30s. And once again, it really gives us a good idea of how we're shifting towards isolationism. Okay, so the first thing we have is we have the Washington Conference of 1921 and 1922. And at this conference, basically the Five Powers Naval Treaty is the result. And basically there's an agreement between the powers, the major powers like Great Britain, the United States, Japan, that we're going to limit the size of navies. The United States and Great Britain are allowed to have large navies because they have a need for large navies because they're on all these different oceans and what have you. Japan is basically given a smaller navy, which angers them to the point where eventually they're going to pull out of this treaty. But it's an attempt to have a smaller military, because a smaller military basically is a smaller chance of war. In addition to this, in the 20s, we see the Americans refuse to join the League of Nations, which is a very good indicator that the United States does not want to be part of the world community. And so basically, we're going to mind our business, you mind your business kind of thing. We also have the ridiculous Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, which outlaws war, which if you could legislate that, that would be awesome, but you can't, so it's kind of dumb. We also see America has a war debt policy that will have tragic results. America insists that war debts be paid. In fact, in the 30s, we actually passed the Johnson Debt Default Act, which basically prevents debt dodging nations from borrowing any from the U.S. So when some of these countries do get attacked by aggressive nations, the U.S. will refuse to borrow the money because you cannot borrow if you owe anything. In addition to that, we do see the United States also kind of pulling away from Latin America in a sense that we're not going to intervene any longer. So the good neighbor policy is started by Hoover and continued by FDR, and we basically stop intervening in the business of any Latin American nation. So we pull our troops out of many of their countries. FDR himself, when he becomes president, also kind of continues this isolationist move. The London Conference is a very tragic event in that the Europeans try to get together to solve this global depression that has hit in the 30s. And basically the U.S. pulls out of the conference, and the crisis continues. And this obviously opens the door for people like Hitler or Mussolini to come to power and consolidate power and demagogue their way to power. In addition to that, we withdraw from Asia. The Tidings-McDuffie Act of 1934 basically gives the Philippines their independence after 12 years of learning how to run their own country, which we will, of course, give them tutelage in how to be a good nation, so to speak. Okay, we also get some very favorable terms in terms of naval bases and stuff like that. So as I already mentioned, and if you need a review on this, please watch the Crash Course World History video on World War II. They'll talk a little bit about Mussolini and Hitler and Stalin and stuff like that. But these are the big time dictators that do come to power during the 20s and the 30s. Not to say that the U.S. could have stopped them from coming to power, but we might have had some influence on how much power they did consolidate. I always find it interesting that Stalin was at one time he wanted to be a priest and he dropped out of school. Hitler wanted to be an artist, dropped out obviously. Mussolini was a journalist. So here you have these three horrible dictators, and you have journalist, artist, priest. So kind of interesting. Anyways, in the mid-1930s, the United States can kind of, I guess, see that there's a conflict that's a-coming. And so the United States basically wants no part in any kind of future conflict with Europe. And so we start passing Neutrality Acts. And these acts are meant to prevent us from getting into a different war like we got pulled into World War I. And so the Neutrality Acts basically say that when a president acknowledges a foreign war, no business can be done with those belligerent nations. Okay, absolutely nothing. We can't sell them anything. You can't give them any loans. You won't do anything with them. And by doing that, if we had done that in World War I, we obviously wouldn't have gone to war because we would have been trading with Great Britain, we would have been trading with France, and the U-boats wouldn't have sunk our ships, which obviously pulled us into that war. And so the Neutrality Acts are meant to keep us out of a future conflict. Okay, unfortunately, the Americans make no distinction between belligerents and innocent nations. And so when democratic Spain is attacked by the fascists, by General Franco, we ignore them and we do not help them. When China is being invaded by Japan, we don't help, we ignore them. And when the Italians invade Ethiopia, once again, we ignore them, we do not help. We just allow this to happen. Okay? FDR does respond to the Japanese and Italian aggression with his very famous quarantine speech, which basically uses the argument that these parts of the world are sick. They're full of evilness, and so we need to quarantine ourselves from them. We need to separate ourselves from them so that we do not get sick. And so basically we put economic embargoes on some of these belligerent nations like Japan and Italy, and that really doesn't have too much of an effect on their behavior. Those countries still maintain their aggressive postures towards other nations. And of course last year, I'm sure you remember the whole deal with appeasement. And I think a lot of times we give the Europeans a pretty bad rap and kind of ridicule them for their appeasement, but I kind of have a different opinion on that. But anyways, we'll get to that later. We do know that Hitler's watching all this going on. Hitler's watching Japan take what they want. Hitler watches Italy take what they want. And so Hitler's going to start testing the French and the British to see if he can get what he wants. And so he slowly starts to chip away at the Treaty of Versailles. He remilitarizes Germany, which goes against the Treaty of Versailles. He rearms the Rhineland, which is this area right here, which the Germans were not allowed to have a military presence in because that's how they invaded France the last time, is through this area. And when he does these first two things, the French and the British just kind of look the other way and don't really do anything, which is simply going to encourage Hitler to go ahead and take more. Okay, and then he gets more aggressive, and then he annexes Austria. Now Hitler is from Austria himself, and people always say Hitler wasn't a German, but what we have to understand is that there were ethnic Germans living throughout Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. And if you've ever read Hitler's book Mein Kampf, which is a lovely read, just kidding, it's insane. One of his major goals that he professes throughout that book is that he finds it to be an embarrassment that there are Germans that aren't living in Germany. And he thinks that a mighty nation needs to have all of its people under one flag. And so some of his first actions in World War II is to get that goal. So Austria, which is full of ethnic Germans, is annexed, and it's bloodless. They just basically swallow Austria up, and the French and the British do nothing. Next, Hitler gets very aggressive, and he demands the Sudetenland, which is this light green here, border region of Czechoslovakia, which is full of ethnic-speaking Germans, and Hitler demands that he gets that territory. And the French and the British say, I'll tell you what, we'll let you have it as long as you promise not to take any more. And he's like, sure, whatever, I promise. And they give in to him. And so Czechoslovakia is basically sold out by this action by the French and the British. Now, like I previously mentioned, I think we oftentimes give the British and the French kind of a bad rap here with appeasement, because let's be honest, you know, we don't throw down for every little thing that goes on in today's world. You know, North Korea was building nuclear weapons. We didn't stop them by going to war. We tried to do embargoes and we tried to isolate them, and it failed. Iran right now, they're trying to build nuclear weapons. Are we going to go to war to stop them? And so I think that it's important to recognize that the British and the French, I mean, they're just 20 years removed from World War I, where they lost millions of people and their population was decimated, their economy was in ruins. I mean, they don't want to get into another war like that. Who can blame them? And on top of that, we find out that the British themselves actually kind of wanted a strong Germany, because the French and the British were actually petrified of this massive communist Russia. And people were worried that communism would spread throughout Europe. And I think many people at that time felt that a strong Germany would protect Western Europe from communism, because fascists and communists are completely different. And so I think it's oftentimes I think people fail to recognize the complexity of appeasement. I don't think it's a ridiculous concept, because, like I said, we appease people all the time. We don't throw down and go after North Korea or Iran or any other country that doesn't you know, do the right thing, so to speak. You know, dictators have come to power, and we've ignored that. So I don't know. Some things are worth fighting for, some things aren't. Now, clearly, looking back in retrospect, you can say appeasement was probably a mistake. But at the time, I don't think it was that crazy of a decision. But anyways, as we all know, appeasement does lead to war. Hitler knows that Europe is weak. We know at the time the British and the French are rushing to get a treaty signed with the Soviet Union to hopefully check the Nazi power. But basically what does happen is that Germany does, in 1939, go ahead and sign this non-aggression pact with the Soviets. Because Hitler doesn't want a two-front war. He fought in World War I. He knows the dangers of that. Now this shocks everyone, because the Soviets and the Germans are basically hate each other. And so the fact that they would ally themselves is kind of shocking to many. But if you do think about it, one of the things that the Treaty of Versailles does do is that it does create all these little countries over here, like Ukraine, Belarus, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland. And all these countries were created out of German and Russian territory. And so it's important to note that the very first act of World War II is to right the supposed wrongs of the Treaty of Versailles, when Russia and Germany take back what they consider as their land, their rightful land. And so September 1st, 1939, Poland's invaded, not only by the Germans, but by the Soviets. The Soviets invade a couple weeks later, which I always found to be fascinating, because when World War II does start, there's two belligerents. There's Germany and there's the Soviet Union. The Soviets invade Poland, and the Soviets also invade Finland. Yet the French and the British only declare war on Germany, and eventually will ally themselves with one of the original aggressors. But anyways, Blitzkrieg is an incredibly successful strategy. The Germans run through Europe. By 1940, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, Netherlands, and France are all kind of gone. They've fallen. Poland as well has fallen as well. So the Germans are incredibly successful early on. Now, when this happens, FDR is obviously very concerned. The Americans are very much pro-British. They're very anti-Hitler, anti-Nazis, but they're still not willing to get into a war. And so what we're going to see happening starting in 1939 is that FDR is going to try to move the Americans, you know, get them closer and closer to realizing that they have to get more involved in this conflict. Okay, and so the Neutrality Act of 1939 establishes the cash and carry policy. And if you just look at the name, cash and carry policy, you can pretty much, I guess what the policy says. That if you have cash, we will sell you stuff, only if you carry it back yourself. Once again, the Americans don't want to get into a war. We don't want to get into debt. We don't want to have these people indebted to us and not pay back their debts. And we don't want to have our ships getting sunk by U-boats. So we basically say to the British and the French, hey, buy our stuff, but give us cash and carry it yourselves, okay? Because at this time, once again, only 2.5% of Americans support entering this conflict. So FDR, even though he wants to help the British and the French, he knows that his hands are tied because the American people will not support a war yet. However, selling all these war materials to the British and the French, mainly the British because the French do go down pretty quick in World War II, this actually starts to pull us out of the Great Depression. Which we probably wish there was other ways we got pulled out of the Great Depression instead of a massive world conflict that kills tens of millions of people. But hey, anyways, FDR continues to help out the British as much as he can, as much as the American people will allow him to. The Destroyers for Bases deal of 1940 basically is a major violation of neutrality, but FDR basically says to the British, here's 50 destroyers, give us some bases in return. And the British agree because the British need destroyers to combat the U-boat threat. But the British are in very dire, have a very difficult situation here because France has fallen and Britain's all that is left to face the Nazis. But once again, the Americans are not willing, the American people are not willing to get in this fight yet. The American First Committee is an isolationist group that is created, and they kind of have this concept of, man, Fortress America, which sounds like kind of a comic book movie. That basically that, we need to defend our own homeland, and if Hitler wants to come get some, he can come on over to us and we can beat him back, but we're not going to get involved in a European conflict again. And this Dr. Seuss cartoon over here, I thought, is always one of my favorite. I love this cartoon. I think it's so funny. Many people don't know that Dr. Seuss himself was actually doing political cartoons back then, but here you see the woman is America First, and the book is Adolf the Wolf, little swastika there. Kind of creepy little cat here. And a boy with oddly small hands. But anyways, and the line goes, and the wolf chewed up the children and spit out their bones. But those were foreign children, and it really didn't matter. So Dr. Seuss is obviously kind of mocking the isolationist a little bit. But FDR once again continues to get the country ready for war without saying it. He initiates a peacetime draft in 1940, which is pretty intense if you think about it. We'd start drafting all these people into our military. We're not even fighting anybody. But he's basically drafting 1.2 million troops and 800,000 reserves each year. And so the American military is going to get humming here. Okay. Anyways, the Lease Act of 1940 is another critical part of this. Eventually the British run out of money, and they can no longer pay the U.S. for war supplies. And so basically President Roosevelt says, you know what, we need to help out our neighbors, and if your neighbor's house is on fire, you got to help them out. So we're going to borrow our neighbor our hose. And basically what this meant is that FDR was going to basically lend our allies whatever they needed, whether it's weapons, whether it's money, whether it's food, whether it's services. We're just going to help these guys out. And throughout the war, the United States gives at least $50 billion to the Allies in aid, which is critical in winning the war. And if you look at this map down here, it actually shows, based on how big the arrow is, where aid was given. So we gave lots of aid to the Soviets. We gave a ton of aid to the British. But here you can see there's Russian aid going up here, there's Russian aid going over here, there's aid going to the British in India, there's aid going down here to the Philippines, or I'm sorry, Australia area. And so there's a lot of aid being given by the Americans. So the Americans really financed the war for the entire Allied alliance. And then finally, 1941, which obviously is a year that many Americans are very familiar with. That is the year that we enter the war, with obviously Pearl Harbor in December. But what many Americans don't know is that we were really close to fighting this war even before Pearl Harbor. By 1941, at the Atlantic Charter, or this is a meeting that the Atlantic Conference is a meeting that Churchill and FDR have, and FDR basically guarantees Churchill that the U.S. will get involved in this war, and they basically talk about what they want the war, what they want the world to look like, once they've won. And so this is very interesting that FDR goes ahead and, like I said, ensured Churchill that we will be involved in this war. In addition to that, many people don't realize this either, but by 1941, the United States Navy has been instructed by Roosevelt to engage German U-boats on site. And so unofficial fighting between the U.S. and German navies is going on by 1941, and everyone seems to think that a war is inevitable. But, ironically enough, it does not come from the Germans, it comes from the Japanese. So anyways, we're going to stop there for today.